Good morning and welcome to our parent judge training. Very happy to have all of you here. For those of you on YouTube, this is taking place in Sacramento, California on September 9th, and this is something that we've organized for parents who will be judging in our local and regional debate tournaments in order to give an introduction to policy debate and to judging in general. For people who will be judging other forms of debate, we'll say something about that at the end. But we like to focus on policy debate because it is the best introduction to the basics of the debate game. And once you understand the basics of policy debate and how to judge that, it becomes a whole lot easier to judge any other style of debate. And please, any questions from the audience? I like questions, and I will take them. So I want to begin with what we're going to do today. And the first thing is, what is it that we're talking about? What is policy debate? And it is a type of debate that focuses on a policy proposal within a resolution. We use the same topic for every year, and it is 2-on-2, two people debating two people in each given debate. So when you're judging, here's the most important things for you to think about. The first is, do your best to try and keep your personal views outside the room. The debaters have no idea who you are. The debaters have no idea, for example, in the context of our current resolution, which is education policy, whether you think Betsy DeVos's move towards more charter schools and more privatization is a good thing, or you think Betsy DeVos is the devil incarnate. The debaters have no idea whether you think that. And so the debaters just make arguments and answer what the other team says. And so if you can, as best as possible, keep your personal views out there and just do the best you can to decide the debate based on what the arguments the debaters make, even if you may not think they're right in your own mind. The second thing is it's up to the debaters to adapt to you. Now, there's a lot of people who think that policy debate is really scary, in part because people can talk kind of fast sometimes. And when there's judges who are experienced in this activity and who can understand that, that's great. But if it's a judge who is a relatively inexperienced judge or doesn't have experience with that, it is up to the debaters to adapt to you. And if the debaters are, for example, talking too quickly for you to understand or using a bunch of debate jargon that you don't understand, that is not your problem. That is the debater's problem. And it's up to the debaters to adapt to the audience. This is a communication activity, and it is up to the debaters to adapt to their audience. But for them to be able to do that, you need to be honest about your judging experience. A lot of times, debaters will ask, okay, what's your judging philosophy? What's your judging experience? If you aren't experienced, tell them that. So that say, look, I'm pretty new at this. I don't understand when people talk fast. If you talk quickly, I may not get it, and so be it. And assuming the debaters know that, then it's up to the debaters to adapt to you. If the debaters don't know, then they can't adapt. But assuming you do that, you shouldn't feel bad at all or feel like you've done a bad job if you don't understand what the debaters are telling you. That's on them, not on you. So we focus the debate on a resolution, and we have the same resolution for the entire year. And this year it's education policy. Resolve the United States federal government should substantially increase funding and or regulation of elementary and or secondary education in the United States. And for the entire year, we will be focused in policy debate on this resolution. And so this allows an opportunity for a full year for students to really dig in and get into a lot of different areas of education policy. And throughout the year, you will see a lot of different arguments within the scope of this resolution. So each round will come out to be about an hour and a half when it's all done. And at tournaments, we'll have anywhere from, in our local Sacramento League tournaments, we'll have 4 rounds in one day. In invitational tournaments, which will be at other high schools or on college campuses, we'll have probably 6, sometimes 5 preliminary rounds and then some elimination rounds. And so there's a number of these that happen in any given tournament. But the way each round works, each round will have 8 speeches. Each person in the debate will be speaking twice. So the first speech is called the first affirmative constructive speech. It is 8 minutes long, and we'll talk a little bit more in future slides about what each of these speeches is. But as an overview, the first affirmative is a pre-written speech that people will have when they walk in the room, and it is the initial argument why the affirmative thinks the resolution is true. After that, there'll be a 3-minute cross-examination period, which is the debater who is not speaking next has 3 minutes to ask questions. Then comes the first negative constructive speech. That is 8 minutes long. Some of that will be pre-prepared, some of it won't be. And that'll be some arguments that the negative makes, why the resolution isn't true, and then answering what the first affirmative says. And then another 3 minutes of cross-examination. Again, the person who is not speaking next will be doing the cross-examination. Then the second affirmative constructive has 8 minutes to answer the arguments that the first negative made. And then another cross-examination. And then we have the second negative constructive, and I'll move over to the next slide to make this make a little bit more sense. We have back-to-back the second negative constructive, which is an 8-minute speech, and then the first negative rebuttal, which is a 5-minute speech. And so the negative gets 13 minutes of arguments, and those debaters generally will not repeat the same arguments. They'll talk about different things in the debate. And then the first affirmative rebuttal gets 5 minutes to answer 13 minutes of arguments. So even if there's an issue with going fast because you can't understand it, you shouldn't get too mad at the first affirmative rebuttal if they talk a little faster, because they have a whole lot of stuff they have to cover. And then comes the last 2 speeches, the second negative rebuttal, followed by the second affirmative rebuttal, and that's where the teams get to sort of tell their final story, make their final arguments, bring the debate together, and explain why they are winning the debate. In general, there are no new arguments and rebuttals. The first 4 speeches are called constructives because that's where the arguments are constructed, and then the rebuttals are where the debaters bring everything together. Now, there may be some situations, particularly in the first affirmative rebuttal, where they just didn't have an opportunity to answer something before, and so they get to do that. But otherwise, there is not new arguments that are made in the rebuttals. And the structure, the affirmative gets the advantage by being able to speak first and last, but to sort of make up for that, the negative gets that big block in the middle in order to make the debate function. So in addition, each team has preparation time to use between speeches throughout the round. And so this changes a little bit between tournaments. In our local Sacramento League tournaments, it is 8 minutes. In invitationals, it can be either 8 or 10 minutes, depending on which one it is. And the teams divide that up however they want throughout the debate. So, for example, the affirmative will take 3 minutes before the second affirmative constructive, and 3 minutes before the first affirmative rebuttal, and 2 minutes before the second affirmative rebuttal. And they can divide that up however they want. They don't need to tell you how much they're taking. You just need to keep track of it. So just have a little stopwatch or a timer or even a little thing on a laptop to keep track of the prep time for each team, just to make sure nobody's taking more time than they actually have. But other than that, it's just keeping track of it. So I mentioned cross-examination briefly already. The debater who will not speak next asks the questions. And there's a number of uses for cross-examination. It can be used to sort of probe arguments and get at the logic of arguments. It can be used to set up arguments that the negative has. Or it can sometimes be just to understand what the heck the other team's arguments are. And you shouldn't fault anybody for asking questions that sound like they didn't quite understand or don't sound real smart. It may be that, hey, wait a minute, I just don't understand this argument. And if you don't understand an argument, you can't answer it. And so sometimes that's just what it has to be. Or sometimes we'll get to how we take notes on a debate. Sometimes a debater or a team will just miss an argument or two in context and we'll say, hey, what was this argument? And if people don't have those arguments, they can't answer them, and so that's not a bad thing at all, and you shouldn't think somebody is not prepared or something because they're asking questions like that. Don't expect the best trial lawyer in the world. That's not really what this is. Some people will get kind of heated in cross-examination, of course. The back and forth can get a little heated, but this is not this is not super trial lawyer thing. And a lot of times it may not be that at all. Maybe just be trying to get information. So the way in policy debate that we construct our arguments is with what we call evidence. And these are paragraphs or longer from articles, books, websites, etc. That make an argument. And what we do is we take those pieces of evidence and we string them together to create the overall argument that people have. And particularly the first speeches are pieces of evidence logically put together to create our arguments. The way the evidence works is it begins with a tagline. That's a sentence that summarizes the argument. And then there'll be the source of the evidence and then actually reading the piece of evidence. And in practice, they probably won't read the whole thing. There'll be highlighted portions that really just highlight the argument and hopefully the logic supporting the argument and doesn't read extraneous stuff that's not helpful in the context of the debate. Generally, for the source of the evidence, you'll just hear the last name and a date. But during the debate, people can certainly ask about source qualifications. People have to have it, and there can be arguments about that. Yeah, Michael.
Could you talk about taglines a little bit more and help me understand what that tagline will look like?
Sure. It'll be a short sentence like good education is key to United States leadership. Read a source and then read the evidence. And generally it won't be more than a relatively short sentence because it's supposed to be a real summary of what it is. So in general, the focus of the debate is around a plan, and that's going to be presented in the 1AC. Let me say in general because at some higher levels of policy debate, this is something that's really contested. But for right now, don't worry about that. For right now, just assume that there has to be a plan. You might judge a debate where there isn't one. Keep an open mind about that. But in general, the first affirmative will present a plan that will be the focus of the debate. That is a particular policy proposal that says the resolution is true. For example, the United States federal government should substantially increase its funding of STEM education, science, technology, mathematics education, for example. And the debate will be about whether doing that is a good idea or not. And the plan will generally be just a sentence or two. The plan is not sort of a super detailed policy proposal. It's not going to have generally, it's not going to have how the policy proposal is funded or how it's going to be implemented. It's the general idea of what a policy action would be. Specific enough to allow a debate about whether it's a good idea, but not getting bogged down on super details. So one way of looking at a policy debate is what we call the stock issues. It's not the only way, but as an introduction, it's a way of looking at how a policy debate works. And if you're using this idea, it is 5 things that the affirmative needs to do in order to win the debate. So first is what we call significance and harms. That is there a problem? Does the affirmative identify a problem that's happening now? Second is what we call inherency. That is, has the problem already been fixed, or is there some reason that the problem won't fix itself? So this, I think, is a pretty low barrier. It's really whether has the plan happened or not. And if the plan has already happened, then there really isn't much to debate. And occasionally that'll happen. That there'll be either something passes in Congress during the year, or somebody just misses something, and they'll make an argument, and gee, that already happened. The third stock issue is solvency. Does the plan fix the problem? The fourth is topicality. That is the plan within the resolution? We'll talk more about that in a moment, but it just, in general, is what the affirmative is saying, the plan, actually saying the resolution is true. And then last is what we call advantages over disadvantages. This is, do the good things that the affirmative says the plan will do, are they more important than the bad things that the negative is going to say the plan causes? And there is a way of remembering this. So if you hear your sons and daughters talking about the shits, they're actually not swearing. They're not saying anything bad. It's actually a way of remembering the stock issues for policy debate. Yeah.
So can you clarify inherency a little bit more for me? So if the problem's already been solved, and I'm on the affirmative and I'm arguing for this plan, as a judge, am I just supposed to dismiss their entire argument now? Have they just automatically lost the debate? What happened?
Well, not necessarily. It depends whether the negative actually makes that argument. You may know that something has already happened. If the negative doesn't make that argument, that's what I'm talking about, leaving what you know outside the room.
Right.
That would be a comment you might want to make afterwards, either on the ballot if it's a local tournament where they don't allow discussion with the debaters, or if it's at an invitational tournament where you might be able to if you want, not required. Then you might want to tell them that. But if the negative doesn't know, that's on them. But if the negative makes the argument, then there may very well be a debate about it. The affirmative may know and may still have some reason why what they're doing is different enough than what happened that it's still okay, that there still is some sort of barrier to the plan happening.
Okay.
On that same note, are we better off to know as much as we can about education policy going on right now, or to try to avoid it at some level? Although we have children in the system, so it's really hard. But from like a judging and debate level,
I
you said leave it at the door, but
yeah, I don't think it matters either way,
Okay.
to be honest. I think do the best you can to leave it at the door. If there's stuff that you happen to know that you can impart to the debaters after the debate, that's not a bad thing. but beyond that, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. I mean, if you want to read in the topic and come up with ideas for your sons and daughters, that'd be great. But other than that, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. So let me say a little bit more about topicality. And this is the question of whether the plan, that is the plan that the 1AC presents, is actually within the resolution. That is, in this case, does the plan substantially increase the United States economic and or diplomatic engagement? And I see I forgot to change something from last year. I thought I caught them all and I didn't. It should be, does the plan substantially increase the United States' funding and or regulation of elementary and or secondary education? And so there are some things that are going to be pretty clearly topical. For example, I think the United States federal government increasing funding for science and technology education, that's probably pretty topical. There are some things that are probably not topical. For example, the United States cooperating with China about climate change. That was last year's topic. There are some things that are going to be a close call. An example of a close call I thought of, and I see I typed it in the wrong place again. An example of a close call would be reforming teacher tenure is the example that I came up with. Is that actually changing education? I don't know. We can debate about that. Is that just about employment, or is that actually about elementary and secondary education? And that would be a debate about what the resolution actually means and whether the affirmative is actually within the resolution or not. And you will hear in a lot of debates, you'll hear arguments about why the affirmative isn't topical, and see what happens. That will flush out as the debate goes on. So on the negative, there are a number of things that the negative can do. The first is, we just mentioned, they can argue that the affirmative is not topical. Second thing they can do is argue a disadvantage. That is, something bad that the plan will cause. And a note about that, you will often hear disadvantages taken out to what some may think is a logical extreme.
Nuclear war!
Yes. X will cause Y will cause nuclear war. That's the way this game works. It's not people being crazy. Or other ways that there will be extinction of the human species. So don't be surprised when that happens, and it's up to the debaters to defend those arguments when the opponent makes arguments against them, and then it's up to the debaters to make arguments at the end of the debate. Which impact is bigger, which impact is more likely, etc. A third thing that the negative can do is called a counterplan. And this is a different plan than the affirmative to do essentially the same thing. The key here is that the counterplan should be competitive. That is, you cannot do the plan and the counterplan at the same time. The idea essentially is that counterplan is an opportunity cost of the plan. So since we can't do them both, and the negative has a better way to do it, that means the affirmative is a bad idea and the negative is better. These can be actually outside the topic. This can be something that is not topical. So on this topic, for example, a very common counterplan that you will hear is that the states should do the plan instead of the federal government. That is outside the topic. They'll make arguments why you can't do them both at the same time. and then that'll be a debate to be had, which is better. And the affirmative will make arguments why you really can do them both at the same time, why the counterplan's a bad idea, etc. There is one other type of argument that the negative can make. Don't worry about them right now. The only reason I mention it is because despite, even if you say you're not a particularly experienced judge, some teams might do this. It is called a critique. It is a philosophical challenge to the affirmative. And I don't want to say much more about that to avoid confusing folks. Just do the best you can to follow the argument and evaluate it is the best I can say for right now. Yeah, Mike.
Remind me again why critique is with a K.
It's the German philosophy.
What's that called again? Was there a person associated with that? No.
There might be, but
Okay.
I probably should know that.
It just helped me remember because the K is, they call it a K all the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm running a K.
So I mentioned counterplans, and here's a slide exactly on that. Different plan in the AF, competitive, can be non-topical. It can be topical too. There's arguments about whether that's legitimate, but sometimes it will be topical. Just a different way of doing something, with the argument being that once the affirmative has presented their plan, the rest of the world is what the negative gets. And a good example on this topic is the 50 states doula plan. So for example, the affirmative is the United States federal government should increase its funding for STEM education. The counterplan would be the 50 states should increase their funding for STEM education. And then we make arguments why can't you do the same? Why can't you do these at the same time? And there would be reasons why that would be, and that's what you get to sift out at the end of the round. So we have a way in policy debate of taking notes. It's called flowing. And it's a way of writing arguments in the debate in columns so that you can see all the arguments next to each other. So when you come to judge, the easiest thing to do, if you can bring two pens, two different color pens, so you can easily see affirmative and negative, you put them in different colors. And just bring some blank printer paper. And there'll be an example when we have the sample debate this afternoon. I'll do a sample flow on the board to show you. But the general idea is that you'll divide your paper into 8 columns. And so one for each speech. And then as best you can, put each individual argument on separate sheets of paper. And we can come back to this since we'll have some time. I brought some sample flows for you to look at. If you would like to do that, we can do that after I'm done with the PowerPoint. They are my flows from several debates I judged last year. These should not necessarily be a model of what a good flow is. They just show the format in general. And the key is, it may not be super pretty. Mine are not. But as long as you can read them and know what you wrote down, you're in good shape. The only other thing about flowing is you'll want to abbreviate things because you won't be able to get everything down. So you'll want to, so major things in the topic, like you won't want to write out education. You might want to just write out ED or E with a circle around it, for example. And there's several other abbreviations that I use, like increases, I'll put an arrow, decreases, I'll put a down arrow, causes, I'll put a side arrow like that. Just for example. And you'll work through that as you judge a few debates. You'll figure out what works for you. Now, policy debate, like any other form of life, develops its own language, its own jargon. And a good debate for you will be one that actually translates the jargon into English, so you know what the heck people are talking about. It doesn't always happen. So I want to give you at least an idea of what some of the jargon is that you might hear, so it's not totally confusing. I mentioned that the arguments are put together pieces of evidence. That will sometimes be called a card. And the reason for that is because way back in the Stone Ages, we cut out articles and we taped them onto 3x5 index cards and carried around big boxes of 3x5 index cards. And that name has sort of stuck and is sometimes used. And let me note here, I didn't say it before, people can make arguments that are not based on evidence. People can just make analytical arguments, and that's a good thing. And those should be evaluated in the debate. It's not an invalid argument just because there is not a piece of evidence to back it up. One can attack arguments just using logic, and that's fine. And we'll get to what some of those things are. The term drop is when one team says the other team didn't answer an argument. And when an argument is not answered, it's assumed to be true for purposes of the debate. I'll get to that when I talk about how you can actually evaluate a debate. But you will hear the term drop a fair amount. And I may have missed a term that I'll say more. The term link is used generally in the context of a disadvantage, and that is what the affirmative does to cause a bad thing to happen. So it is essentially the connection between the affirmative and the bad thing that the negative says is going to happen. The impact is what the bad thing is. I'll sometimes, when I'm teaching this to students, I'll sometimes say the boom. Whatever it is, whatever horrible thing, either the disadvantage causes or voting affirmative avoids from happening. Fiat is the idea that the affirmative can essentially wave a magic wand and say the plan happens. So when the affirmative presents the plan in the first affirmative, we get to, because of the affirmative's power of fiat, we get to assume that the plan happens. And the reason that we do that is we don't have to argue about, are there really 51 senators who will pass this? Will the president really sign this? We don't have to worry about that. With the power of fiat, we just get to debate about, is the plan a good idea or not? And we don't have to worry about, will it actually happen? We get to actually dig into the debate and dig into the policy area without worrying about sort of those real world, will it really happen? And so that's what fiat lets us do. A turn is an argument that says what the other team said is really the opposite. So example, they say the federal budget deficit, they read a disadvantage that say the federal budget deficit is bad, and you increase the budget deficit. The affirmative says, we say the budget deficit is actually good. That would be a term. It's saying the opposite. And so saying that one team's argument actually helps the other team. One other piece of jargon you might hear is the term extend. And this is when a debater is telling a judge, I want this argument to continue in the debate. So they will say, extend the whatever piece of evidence, it says this. And that is telling you, yes, this argument is continuing in the debate. And you'll see when you look at the flows, you'll see this. To notate that on your flow, you'll draw an arrow on your flow to show that the argument is extended and continuing in the debate. So, you've gotten to the end of a debate. How do you actually decide the debate? I mentioned already, do your best to keep your personal views outside the room and decide the debate based on the arguments that are actually made in the round. Really try not to make arguments for the debaters. That's hard to do. I mean, you might hear things that you really know are completely wrong. And if the other team doesn't make that argument, that's their problem. You may hear the affirmative and you may think, good Lord, that's not increasing elementary or secondary education in the United States. That's not topical. And if the negative doesn't make a topicality argument, doesn't matter. Forget it. What you're going to want to do is look at the arguments left at the end of the debate, and your flow will tell you which arguments are answered and which are not. And what will happen sometimes, happen a fair amount in higher level rounds, is the negative will make, 4 or 5 different arguments, but at the end of the debate, there will only be 1 or 2 left. Because they've sort of winnowed themselves down throughout the debate, and there's an idea that it's much better to focus on 1 or 2 arguments and give a really good explanation of those arguments instead of trying to talk about 5 different things in the last speeches. And so your flow will tell you what's left. If there's something that's not left at the end of the debate, you don't want to vote on it. You may think that the negative had a great topicality argument, but the negative decides in their last speech, yeah, we're not going to go for that. We're going to go for the disadvantage and the counterplan instead. That's their choice. Topicality argument's gone now. You may make a comment to them for the future. Hey, I really thought you were winning the topicality argument. You should have gone for it, but don't vote on it because it's gone. Now, there may be situations where there's turns or something on it that it'll still live at the end of the debate, and you'll just have to listen to that. But in general, what you don't want to do is arguments that are gone, that are just not mentioned in the last rebuttals, don't vote on them. Because the debaters decided they're gone from the debate. And I have that here already. And again, that's probably, we think as coaches that that's probably pretty good strategy because there just isn't enough time in the 2NR to go for everything. Just can't be, in general, it can't be done and give a good explanation. And so it's not that a team is giving up when they don't have all of their arguments in the last rebuttal. It is more likely that they are engaging in good strategy. 99% of the time anyway, if the negative wins that the affirmative is not topical, the negative wins. That's one of those things that if the app isn't topical, the game is over. A decent analogy for that is if you bring a lawsuit and the court says it doesn't have jurisdiction, then you lose. It doesn't matter how good your lawsuit is, you're going to be gone. So that topicality is kind of like that. And the better speakers don't always win. It is very possible for one team to sound a whole lot better and speak a whole lot better than the other team, but just forget to answer a critical argument in the debate, which means they should lose. And that is just fine. We call it a low point win. It happens with some frequency. So don't be surprised if that happens. That's okay. And I also will tell, both when I'm judging and tell debaters, even if someone's sounding a lot better than you, or you think you're losing, don't give up, because the other team might make some bad mistake in their last speech and just forget to answer something, and you can grab victory from the jaws of defeat. Even if it turns out you'll have lower points, you'll get a win. And I have speaker points here. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But again, the other thing you're going to be doing is writing a ballot. When you make a decision, you will write your reasons for the decision in a ballot. Now, I know in the local middle school leagues, they often have parents actually discuss their decisions with the debaters. You do not have to do that. You can if you want, but at least until you are comfortable until you're really comfortable judging, I would recommend not doing that, because sometimes debaters can respond, and you don't need that. For experienced judges and coaches, it's a really good educational thing to have a conversation about what happened in the debate with the debaters. But for you, you really don't have to do that, unless you are actually comfortable doing it. And your ballot, now I need to say, it may be one of two ways. In our local league rounds, it's going to be on a piece of paper that you can just write it out. At many, if not most, invitational tournaments, and at one local tournament that Mark and I will be running, your ballot will actually be electronic. It'll be on a system called Tabroom, and we'll help you set up accounts on Tabroom, but it allows you to just type in your ballot either on a laptop or even on a phone, even on a handheld device. And then just type it in, hit send, and we don't have to worry about running all over the campus anymore to get our ballots submitted. So it takes a little getting used to use the system, but once we get you up on it, I know we really like it. It makes running tournaments a whole lot easier. But when you are writing your ballot, try and focus on the arguments in the debate. Something like, I vote aft because the affirmative solves global warming, which outweighs the risk of economic collapse. So you looked at the arguments and you weighed them and you listened to what the debaters said. And based on what the debaters said, the affirmative wins that they're going to stop global warming, and the negative wins, well, there's a chance it'll cause economic collapse, and based on what was said, you think global warming is a bigger impact, and it's more likely, and so you vote affirmative. That's the kind of thing you want to focus on if you can. You want to try and avoid things like, I voted aft because the affirmative sounded better. That doesn't help people very much. You can make comments about, I thought the affirmative, I thought the first speaker stuttered a lot and that sort of hurt your presentation. That's okay, because that's something that can be used to help presentation later. But something like, the aft sounded better, so I voted for them, is not particularly helpful. Really, really try and avoid personal comments about the debaters. In part we just shouldn't do that, and in part because you just never know what the debater's situation is. And I have on here the worst comment that I have seen on a ballot in my time, and it was a comment on the ballot, why are you not wearing makeup? And as innocuous as that sounds, it was a Muslim girl who was at war with her parents about whether she should be wearing makeup or not. And so it was just, there was no way, we shouldn't be saying things like that anyway, but the judge had no way of knowing that that was potentially the most hurtful thing imaginable to the student. Since we just don't know, leave it out. Luckily, the coach saw that ballot and it magically disappeared before the student saw it. But, some other examples that I've seen, your sweater isn't formal enough, or why don't you have a tie on? We don't know who the students are, particularly with the Sacramento Urban Debate League in Sacramento. We have a lot of low-income students who are involved who may not be able to afford a three-piece suit. And really, let's not hold that against people. Let's do our best to just judge based on the arguments that are made in the round and try and avoid The last thing you're going to need to do is speaker points. And each debater gets points for how well they speak in the round. And it's between 1 and 30. In the league rounds, it doesn't make that much of a difference. We don't use them for anything. And we actually, on the paper ballot, we have these 6 areas and check boxes that you're supposed to use. Don't even worry about that. Just try and, 29 and 30 is super, super really good. 27, 28 is pretty good. 26 is decent. And then really you want to go only between 25 and 30. You really don't want to go below 25. And then don't go below 22 unless somebody is very, very offensive, says something super racist, super sexist, whatever it happens to be. Then it's maybe worth it to express your displeasure with that by giving below a 22. I have done that once in over 20 years of judging. So really 25 to 30 is the best. And you can use half points if people are close. You can give somebody, 28.5 and 28.3 or something. And the point is to just make the gradation for who was a little better in the round. And it's important in the invitational tournaments because that is how we determine teams with the same record who advances and where they are in seeding for elimination rounds. So if there's 8 teams who are 4 and 2 and there's only room in the elimination rounds for the top 6, most of the time we'll determine who advances by which teams have the higher speaker points. And so it's important for that reason, as well as feedback for the debaters. So let me say a note about some other forms of debate that you might judge. Particularly in the local league, you will be asked to judge many different forms of debate. In invitational tournaments, generally you'll just be judging policy debate unless a tournament is in trouble. But in the local league throws everybody together. So one type of debate is called Lincoln Douglas. It is 1-on-1 instead of 2-on-2. It's a much shorter debate, and it focuses on values and philosophy. The topic changes every 2 months. I did forget to put in the new Lincoln Douglas topic. I honestly don't know what it is. I can look it up if people care. That was the one for September through December 2016 as an example. There is another form of debate called public forum. That is 2-on-2. And the topic changes every month. And again, I forgot to look up the new public forum topic. The one from last September, October, happened to be education. It was searches in schools. The thing that's a little different about public forum is there's the cross-examination periods in public forum, and then there's something called they call them the crossfire. And then in public forum, at the end of the debate, there's something called the grand crossfire, which is all 4 debaters asking each other questions at the same time. It generally doesn't get too out of control, but it can. And again, this is a much shorter debate, so it's a little less in-depth. Not a criticism, just it's a little less in-depth. And also because people only have the topic for a month, they've had a lot less time to do research on it, and so the arguments, there's going to be less evidence and more analysis in that style of debate. The last one I want to mention is called parliamentary debate. It is 2-on-2 in debate, and it is a different topic every round. And so the debaters get their topic 20 minutes before each round. They have 20 minutes of preparation time, and then they go. And there is no cross-examination in parliamentary debate. There is no preparation time in parliamentary debate. One other thing that's different is the questions that can be asked, the other team can ask during the debate, can we ask you a question? during the other team's speech. And that's perfectly legitimate, and that happens all the time. And so it's different in that way as well. The other forms of debate, there isn't direct interaction between the teams except for cross-examination. In parliamentary debate, you can actually interrupt the other person's speech and ask to be able to ask questions, and that's perfectly legitimate and happens all the time. And for these other forms of debate, what you'll get at our league tournaments anyway, there'll be handouts with the exact times for each type of debate, and so that'll make it easier for you to time it and keep track of the length of everybody's speeches, and if there's any funny rules for those debates, you'll get a rules sheet. It's not up to you to be super, stringent on the rules. It's up to you to just sort of judge the debate, and if somebody thinks the other team is cheating in some way, that's a discussion to have. But like I say, these other types of debates are shorter and a little bit less in depth. And so if you can handle policy debate, a longer debate with more in-depth arguments, then you'll be just fine judging these other kinds of debates, with the same general ideas, keeping your personal views outside the room and doing the best you can to judge just on the arguments that are made in the debate and flowing the debate, taking notes and keeping track of what goes on, then you'll be just fine. Those concepts translate equally to each of these other forms of debate. Let me stop there for a moment and ask if anybody has questions. I hope people do.
I've got one.
Yes.
Policy debate, is it allowable to flow on a laptop?
Yes, it is. If somebody wants to flow on a laptop, you can do that. There are templates that exist to be able to do that. There's probably some, if you Google them, that you can download. When we're teaching our debaters to debate, we don't like to do that because we want people to actually have the piece of paper in front of them, and we think it makes it much easier to follow for a debater in a round. But for all of you, if you would like to use an Excel spreadsheet that's set up in 8 columns, you certainly can do that. If that works better for you.
Much faster typer than
Yeah. In that case, yes, that's just fine.
When there's no plan in the 1AC, what is that called?
It can be one of two things. Occasionally, it's just a mistake that somebody meant to read a plan and they didn't, and that's a problem for them. If it's intentional, the term is called a critical aff. It is an aff that defends the resolution, and I'll put a star by that in a moment. It's an aff that defends the resolution without actually presenting a policy proposal to do so. And it's an argument that generally will be a lot more philosophical as opposed to based on policy, which, as you might imagine, opens up a completely different universe of potential arguments. And while it is more complicated to begin with, and sometimes more complicated to judge, I'm a fan of it because it opens up for the students another completely different area for them to look at. Not only do students learn about education policy, they also get to learn about continental philosophy. They get to learn things that you don't see until, upper division or graduate level philosophy classes sometimes. And it's just an amazing opportunity for students who want to engage in that and can understand it. But to begin with, it can be super confusing.
So we wouldn't normally run into that as a parent judge, or can we?
I don't think you should. I think when you tell debaters that you're a relatively inexperienced parent judge, we certainly tell our teams, don't read a critique because it's just too complicated. Now, other coaches may not subscribe to that and may try it. So you shouldn't be surprised if it happens. But I don't think it'll happen all that often.
I would completely agree. I think most coaches in general instruct their debaters to not run critical affirmatives in front of parent judges. That type of argumentation is typically presented to coaches and judges with significant experience in policy debate. I will say that there's also going to be critical affirmatives that completely reject the topic, and that was Goldberg's asterisk. If you'd like to, or I can explain that.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's affirmatives, and if you're a parent of a Sacramento Urban Debate League student, many of our students choose this route, but they will reject the resolution for a variety of different reasons. In some cases, it can be because the United States federal government is enacting a policy, and maybe they feel for one reason or another, the United States federal government has not done a great job in the past of enacting policies in primary and secondary schools. Maybe they've got some things that they want to say about that, and they're using the debate as an opportunity to express those things. Now, is that topical? No. And they may completely defend the fact that it's not topical. They'll say, we're not topical. We don't need to be topical, and here's why. If that happens, there's a debate to be had, but once again, these are not rounds that you will typically see. If you did, I would be surprised, and it would be very far few in between.
Yeah, a lot of those debates will focus on whether it's legitimate or to be able to do what Mark just described. And a lot
My
of those
daughter
debates
has
will
that
be about
ability. Yeah, my daughter has that ability, but
Your daughter will certainly be right.
but she would never do it with a parent judge
Right.
because we're not. Like, she wasn't even sure she wanted me to judge because we're not the same level. It's just not the same.
Yeah, and
It's
let me say
totally
something
different.
about
You're
that.
presenting to a different audience.
Right. I mean, to say you shouldn't be judging, that isn't true.
No.
Because it's up to the debaters to adapt to you.
Yes.
But those debates can get very technical and can be pretty intense, and they go both directions, and
These are also things that sort of debating, that sort of like academy is a little bit more in depth for students. Typically, they're not learning that stuff or getting good at it, at least until they're a little farther along. In which case, you wouldn't be judging them anyway because they would be in varsity. And Goldberg and I judge varsity. Other coaches judge varsity. Past college competitors, etc. Judge varsity. We're really hoping to use you for novice and JV debates, where students are probably not as familiar with that sort of argumentation. And even if they are, and some will be, are typically instructed not to present that sort of argumentation in front of parents.
But on the off chance that it happens, do the best you can to do what we talked about. Write down the arguments and do the best you can to evaluate them. And it's up to them to explain them to you well enough for you to be able to evaluate them. And sometimes for those things, it can be even more difficult to leave your personal views outside the room because they are even more fundamental challenges to the system. Things like saying we have to reject capitalism. And that can be even more difficult to keep a personal view outside the room, but just do the best you can with that. And really, as long as you're going to be a good judge, if you can just judge on what happens in the debate instead of your personal views, and you can vote just on the arguments that are made in the round, and you can frame your decision around the arguments that are made instead of around who spoke better, then you're going to be a good judge. And you'll be just fine. And again, if your ballot needs to say, sorry, you spoke too fast for me, I didn't understand you, that's not you. That's not your fault. And that's on them. Other questions?
Well, on that, on what you just said there, is if they are speaking too fast for you personally, is that going to affect their speaker points from you? Is that a legitimate reason to knock them down?
Yeah. If you told them in advance, hey, I'm a parent judge, don't go fast, and they do, then yes. Yeah.
Judges shouldn't ever interfere, right? Like if they're going and they're talking fast, I shouldn't ever be like, I can't understand you. Like they should have already known. I gave them that advice in the beginning before they started to slow down. Like, do we ever stop them? And
Not stop them. No,
Okay.
that's sort of a personal preference
Okay.
On what judges do. I know I will, for example, if a debater isn't clear, I'll yell clear at them.
oh, okay.
Don't stop the debate, but I
Okay.
might just say, I'll yell clear occasionally, or, sometimes I might say too fast. If it's in a situation like that, too fast. Like, for example, in what you described, if you could tell someone is really trying and they're still a little too fast for you, I might say too fast.
Okay.
If someone is clearly ignoring you, then that's their
And that's your
bad.
point.
Then yes, yeah, Michael.
Well, I've experienced that, and so I have it's clear that in a JV round where they may be doing some spreading and they want to do that, you can tell. I'll say, well, if I put my finger up, that means I can't understand, and I've done that, and I've just said, and then they slow down.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it too. And that works very well too.
Generally speaking, it's a debater's job to adapt to you, not vice versa. And that's important to know. It's their job to be persuasive in front of whatever audience they're debating in front of. A debater is going to present different argumentations in different ways in front of you than they would in front of Goldberg or I. If they're not adapting to you effectively, that's their bad, right? That's their problem. That's their fault. And yeah, they should be docked for that. And that will affect their speaker points. Still do your best to try to keep up with everything, but it's also a debater's job to engage with you prior to a round, maybe find out who you are and what your experience is. For judges with more experience, they look us up online and read our judging paradigms. Of course, you all don't have one, and the absence of one tells them something. And they can ask you, hey, what's your judging experience? If you tell them I'm a parent, I've judged a couple of times, these kids should not be speaking too fast in front of you.
Yeah, Michael.
When a team shares, they're either through email or flash drive, sharing plans and things with the other teams. I've been in situations where the judges also have that information. How should we deal with that?
I generally don't do that because I think it's up to the debaters to make the arguments. But it's a preference. Some judges prefer to have it. Some judges prefer to have it because they look at the arguments and take the articles and stuff for their own teams. But
some judges take them so they can flow off them and
Yeah.
not pay as much attention to the actual debaters. It's totally your decision as a judge if you want to have that information and to follow along with it.
I'm gonna jump back to Fiat.
Yes.
Okay, so does that mean, like, as a judge, if they're saying something, they're presenting a plan or whatever, we're not supposed to actually consider the reality of that plan being in effect. We're just saying, this is the plan, this is as is, don't worry all about all the factors that in the real world that would really affect this plan unfolding.
Yes.
Okay, so does that mean, like, if they say something totally off the chain, like the whole nuclear power or nuclear war thing that I was hearing from last year's debate, do we just assume that that's legitimate?
No.
Okay.
No. Fiat is just about the plan
Okay, the original.
itself.
Okay.
It's just about we assume the plan happens,
Okay.
and then the debate is about whether the plan's a good idea or not.
Okay.
So we don't assume that all the arguments that flow that come from the plan, the advantages, the disadvantages, etc. We don't assume those are true. That's what the debate is about,
Okay.
and that's what you're deciding as a judge.
Okay. So the Fiat is the original plan, and then everything from there is what gets judged.
Yes.
Fiat just makes the plan happen.
Okay.
The realities of what happens post-plan, whether it's a good idea, bad idea, whether the advantages are true or not, Fiat doesn't make truth true, right?
Okay.
It just enacts the plan. So we don't have to debate about whether this congressperson is going to vote for it or against
Okay.
it, whether the president's going to veto it. We don't want to.
It just gets to the heart of the matter.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Sure.
I was just, if I want to be sure that I'm simply flowing and looking and literally checklist, what got answered, what didn't get answered, and these last things. If I look at their evidence, I'll have to, it will be in there somewhere, and I will have to be clear. Oh, this was what I heard during the debate, and this was in the evidence that I was looking at their plan. It seems to be you set yourself up for potential failure as being an effective judge because you might put something in that wasn't said. I don't know. That just to me, I was like, I'm hearing you say you can do it if you or if you want to or not. And to me, it's like, well, the downside is judging on something that wasn't said in the right.
Yeah, and
I consider that a bad thing.
That definitely is a risk because people will sometimes have more in their, we call them speech documents, than they actually say. So there definitely is a risk about that. You know, someone will have, you know, in their set of answers to the state's counterplan, they might have 10 answers that they think they're going to make, but in the debate themselves, they have to actually skip 2 of them. And so that's why it's really better to just flow and not look at the speech documents, I think.
I'm missing, how is it you're getting your hands on these things? I mean, what?
You just give your email address in the email
So-
distribution.
So what happens in practice, in actual debate rounds, just about everybody has laptops now and debates from their laptops, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which I can go over. But teams share what their speeches are going to be, their written out speeches, immediately before the debate
With each other.
And the question is, does the judge get that too? And that's really up to the judge. We do that. I know it may seem a little bit elitist that everybody in the activity should have a laptop, but believe it or not, it actually saves everybody money. What we used to do was have the pieces of evidence on printer paper and have everything that way. And we had so many of them that we would carry them in these 12-gallon Rubbermaid tubs, and we would bring 4 or 5. Each team would bring 4 or 5 of them.
Or
to
7 in
tournaments.
my case.
Or 7 in Mark's case. You know, and of course it costs money to transport them. I used to spend literally an entire weekend standing at a copier to get everything distributed to the teams. And so now we don't have to do that. Yes, everybody has a laptop, but I'll take it. We'll make sure people get laptops so I don't have to do that anymore.
But actually, glad you said that, because so are they allowed to be doing research? I mean, as during the debate.
Not during the debate, but what we have is all of our arguments, all of our evidence is on a Dropbox. And so everything that the team does is just uploaded to the Dropbox. And then everybody has access to it.
But I mean, if as a judge, if I'm watching and I see someone's on their laptop doing whatever, there's no, I don't know.
The chances are really good that every known argument to man is in the Dropbox. We're not going to need to go online.
Okay.
Right.
Just double checking this.
You know, every once in a while it might happen. In the league tournaments, for sure you can't do it. There are several other tournaments where there's a rule against it. Some tournaments don't have a rule against it. But in general, most of the time in high school debate, not necessarily in college, but in high school debate, people will not be actually doing research in the round, and it's actually not a good use of prep time anymore.
No, I think it would be a
Unless-
terrible strategy, but I'm just
yeah.
wondering, is there a rule against it? And I mean, and even how would you even be aware of it if it were?
Just cut off the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
I'm a little stressed out about topicality, and that being like a discrepancy between myself and a nearby judge listening to the same argument. Because the example that you used about like the tenure thing with teachers in terms of like referring back to the budget, like I think that is completely topical. But if they start off with something that seems like it's not topical, but they argue their way around it and present it in a way where it comes full circle and it does make sense, like can we just make note of that? And does that really affect
I mean,
I don't know.
yes and yes. And like any other argument, judges may evaluate it differently.
Okay.
I mean, I picked the teacher tenure because I think there's a debate to be had.
Right.
And I know some people do think that's completely topical.
Okay.
It was the best example I could think of as something that was, that there would be a real debate to be had.
Okay. But
So,
at the end of the day, it's our interpretation and our score, right?
well, at the end of the day, it's that, but it's based on the arguments in the round
Right.
as well.
Right.
So you may think a certain aff is not topical, but if the affirmative makes a bunch of really good arguments and the negative drops some of them, you may have to make a decision that the app is topical even though you think it's not.
Okay.
So like anything else, it's based on the arguments in the debate.
Debaters even make an argument called reasonability that says, hey, Judge, we're reasonably topical, and things of that nature. So you're right. What one person can consider topical and somebody else, it's subjective. So what we need to do is just completely allow the debaters to debate that out, and based upon what happens, make a decision. Yeah.
So I have a question about credible evidence. I have, because I've judged before, I always try to write down what the evidence citation is. But how do is that important for me to make a decision whether or not it's credible evidence?
Again, it's up to the debaters to make those arguments.
Right.
If something is not a credible source, if something's a bad source, that's an argument that the debaters need to make.
So making a note as to what the evidence is really doesn't make any sense for me, or does it?
You certainly can make a note for the debaters if an argument isn't made, but a source is not credible and shouldn't be used. It's certainly worth noting on the ballot.
It's good for you to write down the source, but for a different reason. A lot of times debaters will refer back to a piece of evidence by its author or source. So they may refer back and say, Judge, look back to the Washington Post evidence. In terms of whether something's credible or not, that's for the debaters to hash out.
Right.
They may say, my uncle told me that the sky is actually pink and elephants fly and rainbows come out of unicorns or something. And if the other team doesn't say that's not true, then that becomes reality.
Right.
Regardless of what our feelings are and whether this uncle is a good source or not.
Now, can I clarify something on that as well? Because earlier you had said that in policy, generally, the evidence is just like author and date. But in middle school, we do like Washington Post, this date, this author. I mean, is it generally like the full source, or is it generally just an author and a date?
The full source is available. The full source needs to be on the evidence so that the other team will see it. But when you're actually making the arguments in the round, you'll just say the last name and date.
Yeah, typically they won't say Washington Post. Typically they'll refer back to the Farley evidence or something like that.
Okay.
And generally, most coaches teach, that to get from generally credible sources, books, articles, websites, etc. Most coaches will say the line comes at blogs. And if it's a blog that is sourced and has qualifications for their sources, then it's probably good. But if it's a blog that just some person posted it and there's no qualifications and we don't know who it is, most coaches will tell their students don't use those.
So I guess piggybacking on her question, what made me think of it was, if all I'm hearing is Goldberg 1997 and I'm a judge and I haven't seen the evidence list, that's just a name and a date for me, so how would I even consider whether or not it was a legitimate source or not? Because all I'm hearing is a name and a date.
And you don't worry about it
Right.
unless there's an argument about it made in the debate.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you hear Goldberg 97, and if and got my qualifications there, and probably somebody won't make an argument about it if I'm making if it's from my article about evictions from public housing. That's the field that I work in, and I'm an expert in that field. If somebody is quoting me saying I had for some reason written something about neurosurgery, somebody might want to question why a public interest lawyer and debate coach knows anything about neurosurgery.
But
But
again, it's up to the teams to talk about that.
That's right.
Generally speaking, by the way, these students do a lot of research, and there's on any given subject, they know who the authorities out there on that subject are. When somebody, you may hear Goldberg in '97, and you're like, who's this Goldberg guy?
Right.
Believe it or not, most of the time, those students know exactly who that Goldberg guy is.
Right.
So if they make the argument, they make the argument. If not, they know what's going on more than we do.
Right. So it doesn't matter that we don't know who Goldberg
Right.
Any more questions? Let me I brought a couple of my sample flows here.